It is once again Friday morning, which means it is time to hit the road. We are jumping back into what is quite possibly going to be the wrap up for Leviticus. I feel like we really
Surprisingly.
hit the gas on this one.
Yeah.
Well, you jump into this one and you're like, wait a minute, did I read this already? Because so much of this reads similarly that once you get, I don't know, I am of the opinion, and for those of you that are tuning in, I would love to hear your 2 cents on this if you guys conceive of it in the same kind of way. But I feel like this is one of those books that once you get the blueprint down of how to read it, then it's like, okay, you can take that blueprint with you as you're reading through the different sets of rules or guidelines or laws or however you, and we addressed that language piece early on in covering Leviticus of whether or not we should be calling this the book of laws or whatever.
Yeah. 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 Leviticus, the book of instructions. That's what we'll call it, because it
Yeah.
was instructions to Israel as they were, coming into their own and preparing them to have their own. And so coming out of Egypt, they had nothing. They had nothing in place. They just kind of lived, and God gave them instructions to how to live and how to interact with each other, with the hinging, or I would say the central theme is loving God and loving your neighbor. I know we get caught up in the weeds, right, of
Yeah.
all the details, but the ultimate theme that rings through all of what we're reading is a love for God and a love for our neighbor.
Right.
That's what Leviticus is really saying, and that's why Jesus wrapped it all up. He said the greatest law is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then love your neighbor as yourself. He said, if you do this, you fulfill all the law and the prophets, and that includes Leviticus. That includes Leviticus. So
Yeah, yeah, that was it was I want to say 2 maybe 3 weeks ago where we had hit the episode where it was like, okay, you some of this stuff may sound like a square peg in a round hole. It may sound dated or antiquated or something along those lines, but we hit this one chapter where it's like, okay, we're now hitting the Jesus of it all. You know what I mean? This is gonna sound real familiar if you're familiar with the New Testament. So, go ahead and we're going to go ahead and jump into the text. We are picking up with chapter 24. As always, I say as always, but I'm gonna change it up one of these days for on everybody and read out of a different translation. But for now, I am still reading out of the NASB. Um, Here we are. Okay, cool. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command the sons of Israel that they bring to you clear oil from beaten olives for the light to make a lamp burn continually. Outside the veil of the testimony in the tent of meeting, Aaron shall keep it in order from evening till morning before the Lord continually. It shall be a permanent statute throughout your generations. He shall keep the lamps in order on the pure gold lampstand before the Lord continually. Then you shall take fine flour and bake 12 cakes with it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each cake, and you shall set them in 2 rows, 6 to a row, on the pure gold table before the Lord. You shall put pure frankincense on each row, so that it may be a memorial portion for the bread, an offering by fire to the Lord. Every Sabbath day he shall set it in order before the Lord continually. It is an everlasting covenant for the sons of Israel. And it shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place, for it is most holy to him. From the Lord's offerings by fire, his portion forever. Now, the son of an Israelite woman, his father was an Egyptian, went out among the sons of Israel. And the Israelite woman's son and an Israelite man had a fight within the camp. And the son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name and cursed. So they brought him to Moses. Now his mother's name was Shelemith, the daughter of Dibri, of the tribe of Dan. Then they put him in custody, waiting for Moses to give them a clear decision in accordance with the command of the Lord. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Bring the one who has cursed outside the camp, and have all who heard him lay their hands on his head. Then have all the congregation stone him. You shall also speak to the sons of Israel, saying, if anyone curses his God, then he will bear the responsibility for his sin. Moreover, the one who blasphemes the name of the Lord must be put to death. All the congregation shall certainly stone him, the stranger as well as the native. When he blasphemes the name, shall be put to death. Now, if anyone takes any human life, he shall be put to death. But the one who takes the life of an animal shall make restitution, life for life. If someone injures his neighbor just as he has done, so shall it be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Just as he has injured a person, so shall it be inflicted on him. So the one who kills an animal shall make restitution, but the one who kills a person shall be put to death. There shall be only one standard for you. It shall be for the stranger as well as the native, for I am the Lord your God. Then Moses spoke to the sons of Israel, and they brought the one who had cursed outside the camp and stoned him with stones. So the sons of Israel did just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So, first off, I have to say, interesting juxtaposition between reading Acts and reading this. Covering Acts on the podcast, we just got to the part where Stephen's stoned. And so reading this, just an interesting juxtaposition. We've said it before and we've said it again. If anybody comes around claiming to be a Christian, and for what I'm about to talk about, please hear me, is claiming to be a Christian. I am not commenting on other religious practices. Just want to make that clear. Anyway, there's different aspects of the Old Testament law that we talk about. If somebody comes around claiming to be a Christian and is claiming that this is the way to be, then you need to run very quickly in the other direction. Seriously, if anybody comes around talking about eye for an eye and claiming to be a Christian, you need to walk in the other direction as fast as your legs will take you. I'm just saying. Jokes aside, man, you read through, and I'd love to, especially for you being in a different juxtaposition coming out of Joshua and seeing the aftermath of the first five at an intimate level that you really can only get to by really grinding it out in a book. There's so much story in the first five and beyond that. There's so much nuance, and there's so many people to follow and so many things to catch and all of this kind of stuff. It's so jam-packed, but it's so easy you're riding along and you hit a speed bump like this and the whole thing gets thrown off the rails, and you got to go back to the beginning and say, oh, this is this time, this is this place. And it's
right.
And it's almost frustrating when you get to a certain point where it's like, okay, just keep rolling. Yes, different time, different place. Yes, this reads super super intense, but you got to put it into, you got to keep rolling in order to be able to look back and get the clearest picture of what's actually going on and how it fits into the continuity of history.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is um, understanding the how everything is positioned. Everything has a position. Everything has a purpose. Everything is done intentionally and purposefully for an ultimate goal. On the surface, it just looks like, especially from 21st century, because we don't like any type of kind of rules if it, especially if it looks like, man, that's unfair, right? When it looks unfair, it's like, I don't know about this, right?
Mhm.
But when you look at the situation, um, something like this, like you said, you called it a speed bump. Yeah, for some people, it's a blockade.
Yeah.
It's not a speed bump. It's like a brick wall that they just hit. Like, this was fine until I got here.
Yeah.
And so yeah, in this chapter, I just would caution people to be mindful of, remember when this was, and remember the fact that they didn't have what we have today. There's a lot of things that were more grievous and more serious in that time. You talked about Stephen being stoned, and how the Sanhedrin came together to stone him for what they claimed to be blasphemy. They claim that's what they're saying. They're saying that this guy he's talking crazy, and he's blasphemous, and so he deserves to be stoned. And we don't get to see the inner workings of the thinking of this guy. But when you look at Stephen, because Stephen is verbal throughout this process, and you're looking at Stephen, you're like, wait a minute, Stephen actually hasn't done anything. He hasn't done anything wrong. So, I was reading this, I was like, man, I wish I knew what he actually, did, what this guy actually did, what he actually said. Does it matter? Probably not, but our human nature wants to know, so that we can kind of get in there and judge God a little bit, like,
Yeah.
well, God, you didn't have to do it that way, right? So it is interesting what happens when you read something like this. You're moving along and you just hit this bump.
Yeah. So for anybody that reads something like this and they read this and they're like, okay, guys, I was rocking with you guys. We've been going through this thing, but this makes the back of my brain itch with that whole angry Old Testament God thing and all of that kind of stuff. So then to be the voice of the audience, how do you reconcile this and not read that God is way more intense in the Old Testament and way more loving in the New Testament? And before you answer, we've got a quick comment. Good morning. It is Zandra just popping in before I go to work.
Good
Good
morning,
morning. Hope you
lady.
have a great day at work.
Yes, yes.
And feel free for the rest of you guys that are watching, go ahead, chime in, let us know where you are tuning in from, what questions you may have, all of those kinds of things.
Yeah. When it comes down to something like this, well, I don't know. Rephrase, re-ask the question, because I want to make sure I answer this right. Oh,
So we get to moments like this, and these are the types of verses that tend to be trigger points for folks that will come towards the Bible in a posture that says God was angrier, way more intense in the Old Testament, and way more about reconciliation and forgiveness and love in the New Testament. And so, for somebody who gets tripped up on this and struggles with that mindset and is looking for ways to be able to process verses like this, because this is not the last one that we're going
Right.
to come to that would be triggering for somebody who struggles with this mindset, help somebody be able to process the contextualization of like this aspect of God, or God telling the folks to do this sort of thing in relation to like how he's engaging with his people, and that whole idea of Old Testament God versus New Testament Jesus.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that jump out. Is number one, um, you could get kind of distracted by the fact that this is not a native born Israelite, right? And see some type of issue there. Is this giving permission, you know, to mistreat people who are not, considered, your people, right? So I think that jumps off the page to me right away. And really, I think it's being highlighted to show that there is no partiality, that whoever does these things that they were commanded not to do, we're going to face the consequences of that particular command. And so God has established that very strict law from the very beginning. It's like the first three are about honoring God and his name, right? You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not, you take the name of the Lord's name, take the Lord's name in vain. You shall not worship any other gods, make idols. And so this is in the first three of all the commandments. This is at a very high level of what God is desiring for his people to not do. And so when this happens, because of his word,
Mhm.
he has to stand by his word. He has to stand by. And so it's not anger that you see, it's this is what we agreed upon. And guess what? This person was a part of this community at Mount Sinai that said we
Mhm.
agree.
Mhm.
And that's the tough part. And man, and it can mess with you like, well, did they know they were agreeing to this? Yes. He was very detailed. He was very specific. He walked through all of this and said, if you are willing to obey these commands and do what I'm asking you to do, then you will be my people and I will be your God. Do you agree? And they all said yes. You
That
go back. Go ahead.
That's the interesting thing. I'm glad that you had that, because that stood out to me so vibrantly when we covered that section of scripture, that there really is a verbal, like I'm going to put it in modern language.
Yeah.
There really is a verbal contract that
Yes.
takes place. There is an action response, and I think sometimes we can think about the Old Testament in terms of pseudo Calvinism in some respects. And I hate to
Right.
use that phrase because I say pseudo because I don't think it's always this clear cut, like I'm trying to think of this in a sense of predestination. You just think of it so as like, this is what happened, these were the people, this is who God was working with, this is who was following God. That there's like that you can sometimes forget or not really think about the fact that there is this agreement that takes place very plainly, and yeah,
Yeah.
that intensifies then what we're seeing here.
Yeah, this is we talk about God's law or his Torah, the teaching and instruction, right? But we don't think about the fact that this was a covenant agreement, that two parties came to the table and said yes, right? God offered, they said yes, and this is a part of the deal. This is a part of what they agreed to. And I think it was a couple of weeks ago. I think it was on like Let It Rip or something like that that we were on. I'm on so many different. You and me both. We're on so many different podcasts. You don't know which one you said it on, but I think we were talking about accountability, and
Mhm.
accountability needing to be an agreement. It needs to be something that we agreed upon, because you can't hold me accountable to something that I'm not willing to be accountable to. And here, this is the ultimate picture of accountability because they agreed upon this is the way we're going to handle this. And so when somebody does it, whether foreigner or not, whether Israelite or not, because remember, and I love that we covered this way, that coming out of Egypt, there was a mixed group of people, there was a mixed nationality. It wasn't only Israelites that
Yeah.
came out of Egypt and walked with God. And so this person was a part of that covenant agreement at Mount Sinai. And this is within the confines of the agreement. This is not something God is imposing on them and overpowering them and just being vindictive and angry. This is a
Yeah.
part of the agreement, so
Yeah. 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 I would really counsel everybody, remember, we are at chapter 24 of the third book of the Bible. There's a whole lot more ground to cover. I'm not saying don't have questions. I'm not saying don't investigate the scriptures. What I am saying is take in the full scriptures, keep going, keep moving, because it does move on from there. So let's go ahead and jump back into the text here. We are in chapter 25. The Lord then spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I am going to give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its produce. But during the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field, nor prune your vineyard. You shall not reap your harvest after growth, and you shall not gather your grapes of untrimmed vines. The land shall have a, I guess that is where that word comes from, sabbatical. Huh. Okay. Sorry, you guys just watched me live process a word if that's in the Bible. Anyway, the land shall have a sabbatical year. All of you shall have the Sabbath produce of the land as food for yourself, for your male and female slaves, and your hired worker and your foreign resident, those who live as strangers among you. Even your cattle and the animals that are in your land shall have all its produce to eat. You are also to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years, that is 49 years. You shall then sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the Day of Atonement, you shall sound a horn all through your land. So you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. You shall have a 50th year as a jubilee. You shall not sow nor harvest its aftergrowth, nor gather grapes from its untrimmed vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat its produce from the field. On this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his own property. Furthermore, if you make a sale to your friend or buy from your friend's hand, you shall not wrong one another. Corresponding to the number of years after the Jubilee, you shall buy from your friend. He is to sell to you according to the number of years of crops. In proportion to a greater number of years, you shall increase its price, and in proportion to fewer years, you shall decrease its price, because it is the number of crops that he is selling to you. So you shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore follow my statutes and keep my judgments so as to carry them out, so that you may live securely on the land. Then the land will yield its produce, so that you can eat your fill and live securely on it. But if you say, what are you going to eat on the seventh year, if you do not sow nor gather in its produce? Then I will so order my blessing for you in the sixth year, that it will bring forth the produce for 3 years. When you are sowing the eighth year, you can still eat old things from the produce, eating the old until the ninth year, when its produce comes in. The land, moreover, shall not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, for you are only strangers and residents with me. So for every piece of your property, you are to provide for the redemption of the land. If a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor that he sells part of his property, then his closest redeemer is to come and buy back what his relative has sold. Or in case someone has no redeemer, but recovers to find sufficient means for its redemption, then he shall calculate the years since its sale and refund the balance to the man to whom he sold it, and so return to his property. But if he has not found sufficient means to get it back for himself, then what he has sold shall remain in the hands of its purchaser until the year of Jubilee. But at the Jubilee, it shall revert, so that he may return to his property. Likewise, if a man sells a dwelling house in a walled city, then his redemption right remains valid until a full year after its sale. His right of redemption lasts a full year, but if it is not brought back for him within the space of a full year, then the house that is in the walled city passes permanently to its purchaser throughout his generations. It does not revert in the Jubilee. The houses of the villages, however, which have no surrounding wall, shall be regarded as open fields. They have redemption rights and revert in the Jubilee. As for the cities of the Levites have a permanent right of redemption for the houses of the cities which are their possession. What therefore belongs to the Levites shall be redeemed, and a house sale in the city of his possession reverts in the Jubilee, because the houses of the cities of the Levites are their possession among the sons of Israel. But pasture fields of their cities shall not be sold, for that is their permanent possession. Now, in case a countryman of yours becomes poor and his means among you falter, then you are to sustain him like a stranger or a resident, so that he may live with you. Do not take any kind of interest from him, but fear your God, so that your countrymen may live with you. You shall not give him your silver at interest, nor your food for profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and be your God. Now, if a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you, you shall not subject him to a slave's service. He shall be with you as a hired worker, as if he were a foreign resident. He shall serve with you up to the year of Jubilee. He shall then leave you, he and his sons with him, and shall go back to his family, so that he may return to the property of his forefathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They are not to be sold in a slave sale. You shall not rule over him with severity, but are to revere your God. As for your male and female slaves, whom you may have, you may acquire male and female slaves from the pagan nations that are around you. You may also acquire them from the sons of the foreign residents who reside among you, and from their families who are with you, whom they will have produced in your land. They also may become your possession. You may also pass them on as an inheritance to your sons after you, to receive as a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves. But in respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another. Now, if the means of a stranger or a foreign resident with you becomes sufficient, and a countryman of yours becomes poor in relation to him and sells himself to a stranger who is residing with you, or to the descendants of a stranger's family, then you shall have redemption right after he has been sold. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his uncle's son may redeem him, or one of his blood relatives from his family may redeem him. Or if he prospers, he may redeem himself. He then, with his purchaser, shall calculate from the year when he was sold himself to him up to the year of Jubilee, and the price of his sale shall correspond to the number of years calculated. It is like the days of a hired worker that he will be with him. If there are still many years remaining, he shall refund part of the purchase price in proportion to them for his own redemption. But if few years remain until the year of Jubilee, he shall so calculate with him. In proportion to his years, he is to refund the amount of his redemption. He shall be with him like a worker hired year by year. He shall not rule over him with severity in your sight. Even if he is not redeemed by these means, he shall still leave in the year of Jubilee, he and his sons with him. For the sons of Israel are my servants. They are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Okay, so a couple of things, friendly PSA before I kick it over to you. And this is your weekly reminder that words mean things. The words that are used here. I happen to be, as I'm reading through this, I'm realizing that this chapter has a very high concentration of words and phrases that either have just a really bad mouthfeel considering what they mean in a modern context, and I use that phrase modern loosely, modern in relation to the Old Testament. But also just words that, like, I find very often get used by Christendom, and the words don't mean the thing that you think that they mean. Like, if you're running around and using the word pagan, I'm not going to tell you that you're misusing the word pagan. I'm just going to remind you that you should probably take a look at the textbook definition of what that word means. Same thing if you're running around and telling people to fear God. You may want to take a look at the textbook definition of what fear actually means, just to make sure that you're using the right words for the right things if your desire is authenticity to the text. And that's just two words without getting into the litany of words that get used here that, again, we talked about with the whole eye for an eye thing. For some people, this isn't just a roadblock. For some people, this is a blockade. This is a stumbling stone that is very, very hard to get past, because if God is giving the instructions here, if this is God's edict to his people of how to be, how to live, all of that kind of stuff, and he's talking about situations and things like that, then he's acknowledged that this situation exists. And so the stumbling block comes where you hear those words and you put them into a context which makes sense to a modern Western Christian, and then you start to retrofit, and the questions start to come in. Well, does that mean that we serve a God who condones that sort of thing and champions that sort of thing? So help us out. When somebody's reading something like this, when one of our listeners who's really honestly trying to demystify the Old Testament gets to these things, and they start to ask the question, man, this way of being really seems like it was messed up. Why doesn't God just come in and straighten the whole thing out, not work with them where they're at, but literally just say, okay, you guys have it wrong. Let's fix this thing from literally the ground up. Help us to be able to contextualize what's happening here and wrestling with those sorts of thoughts.
Yeah, again, it's a difficult one because this is such a different time. This is such a different world. There are so many different aspects to what's going on here that have to be understood. As we're looking at even this whole breakdown of this the Sabbath year and the rest. And so I'm just going to kind of just walk through and kind of summarize because that was a lot, right? There was a lot going through there. And so the Sabbath year, right, occurs every seventh year. The land is to rest. No planting, no pruning are allowed. Natural growth only, produce for everyone, servants, animals, foreigners, right? The purpose is to give the land rest and an opportunity to rejuvenate, which is, yeah, that makes sense. That's pretty simple. That's pretty easy, right? That's not a major issue. Then you have the year of Jubilee, which occurs every 50th year, and property is returned. Land previously sold is returned to its original owners. This is when we start getting into the area that gets a little bit confusing. Slaves are freed, for the purpose of preventing permanent poverty and ensuring that everyone has a fresh start. And so you say, well, slaves are free. Well, why were there slaves in the first place? Well, this is indentured servitude. So these are people who don't have anything. They have nothing, and so they go and they work for someone who has property, who has land, and they basically make an agreement to work for them, and their family is taken care of. They're taken care of. They have a roof over their head. They have clothes and food, right? Well, at the end of that time, at the end of that 50th year, the hope is that they've, built up something for themselves. And when they are set free, they now have a fresh start. They leave and they can start on their own. They can have their own. But what if they don't? What if they don't have anything? Then they can re-sign up or commit to staying with the people that they're living with, that they're serving. That right there is not what we view as slavery to in our time. Most people, if you're African American or you're considered you a person of color, you think of slavery only in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. That's what you're thinking of, not someone who volunteers to work for someone so that they can have food and clothing and shelter for their family. which is different because it's a different world. I mean, we are privileged that we can go out and fill out an application and go work a job. But in all actuality, that's what this is. That's actually, and people say, no, see, you're trying to water it down, you're trying to make it sound better, but I'm actually not. This is actually
Right.
what this is. This person basically goes and gets a job to work for someone. They make an agreement of how long they're going to do this and what that looks like, and they get food, shelter, clothing. They get taken care of as long as they're in this person's house and care. But 50th year, all slaves are set free. And the other part is if there was land that was sold now, and you got to understand this. This land that was sold was given back. And you say, well, why would that matter? Well, because remember, well, you may not remember, but let me explain that the land is going to be divided up by tribes. And see, we're not at that point yet. And so, like you said, I've already went through Joshua. So I saw them take the land in Joshua and divide it up, and everybody gets their land. And so if you sold land, you're selling the land that was promised to you by God.
Yeah.
So you must be in real dire straits if you're selling this land. And so if you're alive or your descendants are alive on the 50th year, they get their land back because that land is yours. The person that bought it from you even has to not really take it and keep it and really do anything with it. They're basically doing it to help you out, which is this is a whole different world. This is just totally different. You would have to just rearrange your whole thinking to be able to live in this kind of context
Yeah.
where after 50 years, hey, you can get this land back because the goal is for no one to be in permanent poverty, right? They don't want anybody to be without, which on the surface, we're looking at it. We hear slaves, we hear taking people's land, we hear all these things. And it's like, wow, God is just, he's just, a narcissist. He's just, laying it on these people. And, but really, this is about being fair. This is about being just. This is about taking care of people. And it's a type and shadow. And I won't get into that just yet unless we need to, of the redemption, right?
Right.
That comes through Christ. But that's just kind of the basics of it, is that it's really about making sure that everyone is taken care of and no one is without.
Yeah.
I know I
Well
said
said.
a lot.
Well,
If you guys are out there, please ask questions because
yeah.
I've got a lot of material, but I don't know what to cover if you don't
Yeah.
ask any questions.
Right. That's the fun dance that we play every single week because I know for me being um just shorter in the tooth in comparison as far as years spent and all of that kind of stuff, it's easier for me to conceptualize the big tentpole questions that folks end up with in these kinds of in like reading through this section of scripture and all of that kind of stuff. But there are so many different specific nuances. So a couple of months ago, up until a couple of months ago, rather, I read this stuff and I was like, okay, yes, all right, the Sabbath breakdown makes sense that this was ordered, but it wasn't necessarily anything that I put a lot of stock, mental real estate into, anything like that. And I'm like, okay, I don't, I understand that on the fringes of every group of people exist people who take micro doses of information and explode them out and do all kinds of gymnastics. But it didn't really dawn on me how somebody would start to play the gymnastic game with the whole Sabbath thing.
Yeah.
Then a couple of months ago, my broadcast partner decides to add me to a Facebook group where these guys are training for the Olympics, y'all. This is intense. Like the amount of just
Pole
circus
vaulting and
crazy, crazy, the clowns and all. But it's just there's such a focus on God's calendar, the Sabbath, and that if you know the language piece, and you know kind of what the schools of thought are, you know that there is it hinges towards a very, very specific um way of reading the scriptures and conceiving of things of spiritual meaning, all of that kind of stuff. But the main spot where they tend to camp is going into serious theatrics as far as the Sabbath year, and holding to the law of God, and all of that kind of stuff. And so there are people who camp on parts of these scriptures that don't get caught up in the same spots. So I say all of that to say, like, there are so many different avenues that you can go down when making something out of, I'm not going to say nothing, but something that shouldn't be made something out of. And yeah, so when you read this, the thing that strikes me is what you brought out, that there is a means for, in a more modern sense, and I cannot tell you, if some sociologist someplace could tell me this, you can go ahead and sound off in the comments. I mean that I would actually be very interested to know when this term came about. Utopia, that this idea of a utopic society, and what does that look like, and for that there are people who go back and forth of what would utopia, can humans engage in a utopia at all, is it even possible for humans to be, and all these questions that get kicked around and philosophized and all of that kind of stuff. But when you look at the breakdown of how God is structuring this, and telling them to the ways that he's giving them and all of that kind of stuff, within working with the cards that are on the table, and I'm in that has to be stressed, working with the cards that are on the table, it really feels like this is an example of following the ways of God that ultimately bring about life, because of the ways that you are being called to live, giving every person a chance. I don't know. I feel like I just
Yeah.
very, very well could have just stepped in a giant bear
Mm,
trap by saying all of that, but
No,
that's what I get.
no, I think the the biggest thing is the idea of utopia. Like you said, most people would say that just humans just can't, right? And I don't think that this is, a picture of utopia. I think
Mhm.
this is what you said in the latter portion, that God is giving everyone a chance, because these things are set in place. Obviously, now watch this, because He already knows that things are going to get messed up. And so there's going to need to be a reset. That's why I said there's a bigger picture here. There's something larger looming behind these processes, that God builds into all of his processes a way to redeem, a
Mhm.
way to reset, a way to start over, a way to refresh even the land. He refreshes the land, so he even cares about refreshing the land, as well as giving the people a brand new start.
Yeah.
So he's created a process that, there is going to be this redemption, this renewal, this opportunity for people to thrive. Now,
Mm.
within it, there's like little details of, if you defraud your neighbor, don't do this to them, don't do that to them, treat them, fairly, because God knows human nature, right? He knows us. And so these things are in place because it's going to happen.
Right.
People are going to push the envelope. They're going to run up against the line. And I think that's why when you said, utopia, like, yeah, I don't think there it's possible for us to live in a utopian type of society, because of the just human nature. Humans are
Right.
prone to, we're prone to mess up. And so that's why he's creating instructions for when that happens. This is how we're going to correct it, because it is coming, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I only bring that term about as a language model because there's not a lot in the way of comparable language to describe what is being displayed here,
Yeah,
other than the same Christian driven language model that we tend to use. And I mean you and I,
yeah,
like
yeah. I
on Kingdom
yeah,
on the Road. You know what I mean? Like the way that we conceive of it is Christian driven, as it should be. We're
yeah,
literally two pastors sitting here breaking down the Old Testament. Of
right.
course it's going to be, but trying to reach for a language model that, even if it's not the same thing, it's still like it sets the mind in a particular direction, that almost this sense of living as it should be within the context of, like I said, the cards that are on the table.
And this is going to be a kind of a I'm gonna kind of jump back uh, to the previous chapter and then jump forward. At the end of the previous chapter, we talked about the stoning, right? And then right after they stone them, he says, "You shall not take another person's life," right? And so it's like, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? You know, in other words, he says, "Yeah, this needs to be done because this is our agreement, but you
Mhm.
can't do this on your own." You can't
Right.
randomly go out and just do this. It has to be within the agreement that we've made, under the covenant that we've made. No
Yeah.
one can just do this on their own. Well, here you jump into, this particular chapter, 25. I think we're in 25. I'm like, what chapter are we in? They're all blurring together. In 25, he starts breaking down the rules for redeeming the land and property, and so in this it's the same thing. Like, well, there's things that you can do, there's things that you can't do. Well, one of the things that you can do feels like you use the term bad mouth feel like, ah why does he even have slaves, you know and again, words mean things, right? And what he's talking about, or what the Bible is describing here as a slave, is a working man,
Mhm.
is a person working, to take care of themselves. And so, because of that, you can't mistreat them. You
Right.
have to treat them fairly, and you have to give them a chance to get their own, to start their own life. Now, if they don't take that chance and they continue to work for you, it's like, okay, well, then what in our modern sense, well, you just let them go anyway because you shouldn't own another person. Well, they don't necessarily own them, in that sense. you know this is an agreement, and if this person makes this agreement, they honor this agreement, because one of the big things that you're going to find in scripture is that if you make a vow, you keep your vow. If you make a commitment, you keep a commitment. That's part of integrity. And this is just a difficult situation because the circumstances call for these type of agreements and these type of I guess setups, these type of situations. And in our modern sense, like you said, and you used that term very loosely, we are, and people aren't going to like this, we are privileged to have opportunities that they don't have. There's ways to make a living. You don't even have to go out your front door now. Right? Yeah, right? I mean, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You don't even have to go out your front door, and you can take care of yourself. You can make a living. So you don't have to go and, all right, man. Well, hey, Joe, man, I'll live in the back shed, and I'll take care of the housework, man, and because I need a place to live, right? You don't have to do that. As a matter of fact, people are like, oh, you don't have to do that. They'll actually frown on that. They'll actually look down on you doing that, right? Because of where we are in our portion of history, that we have a lot more options than what they did. And so we look at this time and we look down our nose at it, and it's just a different time, and we have to accept that.
Right. Right. And I think that's literally it. I think that's the key as far as breaking like any of those any of the offshoots where you can get lost in the weeds. I think it's an opportunity to say, okay, I'm reading part history here. Part of what is being displayed in the Old Testament is history, and thus doesn't apply to my time frame. So I need to not try and make it apply to mine.
Mhm. I think you said something earlier, and I was trying to process it. The acrobatics, that one Facebook group, well, just the name that shall not be named. That one group, what they do, and it's like, wow, how do they, the way they can, metaphorically or figuratively overlay and overlap these things is just extraordinary to me because like you said, I mean, it's a 20-foot pole vault, and
Yeah,
they're doing some amazing things to create, a spiritual meaning, looking for a way to apply it to us. And some of this, the Bible has already told us how it applies. We don't have to create an
yeah,
extra application layer that is now eschatological, yeah, that is end times flavored to like, okay, yeah, you didn't realize that there was a code in the Sabbath year that is speaking to this event that's coming. And no, scripture actually already gives us what the picture is, and really it's all encapsulated in Christ and his redemption. I think about Luke 4:18, where Jesus says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me; He's anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, to give recovery of sight to the blind, set at liberty the captives." Here we go, and preach the acceptable year of the Lord, or the year of jubilee, right? And so Jesus, basically says, with Him comes jubilee because He sets free the captives, right? He frees everyone, so that this is a time of jubilee, so that in Him is the jubilee. He
mm,
is it. He's the fulfillment of the law. Remember, he said, "I did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it." He's the fulfillment of it. And all he did was quote Isaiah 61, which Isaiah 61 is looking back here at Leviticus and this whole process, that there's this idea of freedom in Christ and redemption and everything that we're supposed to have ultimately in relationship with God. We have that can sneak into eschatology or even prosperity language, right?
yep,
And I don't want to jump ahead because we're going to do some of that work tomorrow. But even that can turn into this big, oh well, God is getting ready to give us wealth, and He's about to, if you lost a house, you're about to get two, and if you had a business closed, you're about to open up, and because it's jubilee. And so it's like interesting how people use these verses in ways that they were never intended, and because it's so intricate and it's so detailed, and you're like, what do I do with this? What does this have to do with me? And so people start doing weird stuff with it in order to make it apply.
yeah, yeah. All right, let's go ahead and jump back in. We are going to pick up with 26.
Oh, one more thing before we jump in.
Yeah.
Your reaction to sabbatical.
Ah, yeah.
Come on, share just a little bit more about that, because you kind of briefly like, but when you read the word sabbatical, it was
Yeah,
like,
I mean, as soon as I took the second to process, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense that word would come from that root word of Sabbath, but I'd never put that together. That those two words are connected because you hear about sabbatical in either like a lot of times with educators or
yeah,
with folks in C-level positions that are taking stepping away from the business for a little while and all of that. And so it's just fascinating that word comes from the same place.
yeah, and it's um, believers, non-believers alike
Hmm.
that use the terminology.
Hmm.
It's just a term, like you said, that it's used in context that you don't even realize that it's connected to this, that this is where this word comes from. And so it was just interesting, your reaction. I was like, oh, is there a story, is there a backstory behind it, what that, because sometimes even around here people say sabbatical, we're like, ah, here we go. You know, like, oh, I need a sabbatical. You know, and like, all right, well, what are we, what are we saying? You know, so I just wanted to kind of touch on what your thoughts were when you read that, because that was
Yeah.
funny. It was like, whoa, sabbatical. It's actually in here.
Yeah, it's for me, it's just interesting when you look at how far-reaching biblical language
Yes.
gets grabbed and moved and transplanted
Yeah.
into a non Judeo-Christian context,
Yes.
and turns into something entirely different, to the point where you could understand that it's not gonna that you never knew that those two words were connected.
Right, right, right. Yep, grabbed and grafted in other places. Yep. All
Yep.
right, sorry about that. Let's go.
All right. So picking up with 26. You shall not make for yourselves idols, nor shall you set up for yourselves a carved image or a memorial stone, nor shall you place a figured stone in your land to bow down to it, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and revere my sanctuary. I am the Lord. If you walk in my statutes and keep my commands so as to carry them out, then I will give you rains in their season, so that the land will yield its produce, and the trees of the field will bear their fruit. Indeed, your threshing season will last for you until grape gathering, and grape gathering will last until sowing time. So you will eat your food to the fill and live securely in your land. I shall also grant peace in the land, so that you may lie down with no one to make you afraid. I shall also eliminate harmful animals from the land, and no sword will pass through your land. Instead, you will chase your enemies, and they will fall before you by the sword. 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 of you will chase 10,000, and your enemies will fall before you by the sword. So I will turn toward you and make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will confirm my covenant with you, and you will eat the old supply and clear out the old because of the new. Moreover, I will make my dwelling among you, and my soul will not reject you. I will also walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. And I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, so that you will not be their slaves. And I broke your yoke and made you walk erect. But if you do not obey me and do not carry out all these commands, if instead you reject my statutes, and if your soul loathes my ordinances, so as to not carry out all my commands, but rather to break my covenant, I in turn will do this to you. I will summon a sudden terror against you. Consumption and fever will make the eyes fail and the soul languish. Also, I will sow your seed uselessly, for your enemies will eat it, and I will set my face against you, so that you will be defeated before your enemies, and those who hate you will rule over you, and you will flee when no one is pursuing you. If also after these things you do not obey me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. I will also break down your pride of power, and will make your sky like iron and your earth like bronze. Your strength will be consumed uselessly, for your land will not yield its produce, and the trees of the land will not yield their fruit. Yet if you show hostility toward me, and you are unwilling to obey me, I will increase the plague on you 7 times according to your sins. And I will also let loose among you the animals of the field, which will deprive you of your children and eliminate your cattle and reduce your numbers so that your roads become deserted. And if by these things you do not learn your lesson regarding me, but you show hostility toward me, then I in turn will show hostility toward you. And I, even I, will strike you 7 times for your sins. I will also bring upon you a sword which will execute vengeance for the covenant. And when you gather together into your cities, I will send a plague among you, so that you will be handed over to the enemy. When I break your staff of bread, 10 women will bake you bread in one oven, and they will bring back your bread in rationed amounts, so that you will eat and not be satisfied. Yet, if in spite of this you do not obey me, but act with hostility against me, then I will act with wrathful hostility against you. And I, for my part, will punish you 7 times for your sins. Further, you will eat the flesh of your sons, and you will eat the flesh of your daughters, and I then will destroy your high places and cut down your incense altars and pile your remains on the remains of your idols. For my soul will loathe you. I will turn your cities into ruins, so well, and make your sanctuaries desolate, and I will not smell your soothing aromas. And I will make the land desolate, so that your enemies who settle in it will be appalled at it. You, however, I will scatter among the nations, and I will draw out a sword after you as your land becomes desolate and your cities become ruins. Then the land will restore its Sabbaths all the days of the desolation while you are in your enemy's land. Then the land will rest and restore its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation, it will have the rest which it did not have on your Sabbaths while you were living on it. As for those among you who are left, I will also bring despair into their hearts in the lands of their enemies. And the sound of a scattered leaf will chase them. And even when no one is pursuing, they will flee as though from the sword, and they will fall. They will then they will then stumble over each other as if running from the sword, although no one is pursuing, and you will have no strength to stand before your enemies. Instead, you will perish among the nations, and your enemies' land will consume you. So those of you who may be left will rot away because of their wrongdoing in the lands of your enemies, and also because of the wrongdoing of their forefathers, they will rot away with them. But if they confess their wrongdoing and the wrongdoing of their forefathers in their unfaithfulness, which they committed against me, and also in their acting with hostility against me, I also was acting with hostility against them to bring them into the land of their enemies. Or if their uncircumcised heart is humbled, so that they would so that they then make amends for their wrongdoing, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and I will remember also my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham as well. And I will remember the land. For the land will be abandoned by them, and will restore its Sabbaths while it is made desolate without them. They, meanwhile, will be making amends for their wrongdoing, because they rejected my ordinances, and their soul loathed my statutes. Yet, in spite of this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them, nor will I so loathe them as to destroy them, breaking my covenant with them, for I am the Lord their God. But I will remember for them the covenant with their ancestors, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations, so that I might be their God. I am the Lord. These are the statutes and ordinances and laws which the Lord established between himself and the sons of Israel through Moses on Mount Sinai. So I feel like the most the most common processing for sake of being generous that I've seen with this chapter um, tends to kind of hinge around the concept of generational curses, to put it into more modern language, right? That these um, that the sins of the forefathers will rain on you, and all of this kind of stuff, because of the language that's being used here, and because and that's what happens when you read the language plainly without any context for what comes before it or anything like that.
Yeah. I think when people go into that, um, they are focusing on, because it's not generational curses, right? Because it's really the iniquities follow generation to generation,
Yeah.
and the repercussions of those that hate the Lord, that disobey the Lord, that rail against him or reject him or choose to be disobedient, their consequences continue to carry on to each generation that continues that mindset. It's not that they're cursed to have that mindset, it's that they're reaping the repercussions of continuing that process. And you actually don't really see that flushed all the way out until you read, like, Kings and Chronicles, where you see the list of kings and how awful these kings were and how disobedient they were, and how
Yeah.
the son of that king follows the same pattern, and his son follows the same pattern. And then there's a king that says, no, we're going to follow the Lord, and brings prosperity back to the land, brings, healing back to the land, brings, restoration to the land, because they stop and they say, wait a minute, why have we been doing this? Why are we committing these things? Why, we know what God has asked of us. And so why do we keep going down this rabbit trail and doing these things that bring about destruction on us?
Mhm.
And so, when people talk about generational curses, it's almost like they're talking about something that attaches itself to you,
Yeah.
regardless of what you do, right? Shameless plug. I did a study a couple of years ago, and I think I put it in a audio podcast, on the subject. And one of the eye openers was, I think it was Ezekiel 18, where Ezekiel 18 breaks down the entire, perspective of, if a righteous man is righteous and he remains righteous, but then does something unrighteous, he is accountable for that unrighteousness, not his son. But if his son does the same unrighteous thing that the father did, then the son is now accountable for that unrighteous thing. But if he turns from that sin, he will be, approved. He will be. And so there's not this thing that you're just doomed to this. Now, of course, when we talk about, and I don't know, I'm not an expert on this. When we talk about DNA and things like that, there's certain illnesses and diseases that are in DNA. This is not a curse, right? But people will say that that's a curse, and you got to break the curse of this. Diabetes runs in my family. Okay, well, then we got to eat better, not just say, okay, well, Lord, you got to break the curse, but then I can just keep eating the way I eat. and just keep doing what I do. And so instead of it being this thing that kind of is just outside of us and attacking us, we have to understand that these people still have a decision to make.
Mhm.
They still have to decide what they're going to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The three areas that I tend to hear this sort of thing talked about is either prosperity, ancestor worship, or the deliverance ministries. Tend to
Yeah.
be the big three that I hear this concept of generational curses around. Real quick before we go further, good morning, Rochelle. Thank you for joining us this
Good
morning. Hope
morning.
your
Good
day
morning.
is
Yeah.
going well. Um, yeah. So I like the way that you addressed it, because I think oftentimes when we start talking about generational stuff, we talk about 2, 3, 4 generations. We think about like this long standing thing and all of that kind of stuff, where God is judging people for the actions of 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 generations beforehand, or for generation after generation. Let's say every generation had an alcoholic in the family, a drug addict in the
There you go.
family, a
Yeah.
gambling addict in the family,
Yeah.
somebody who had a specific ailment that's genetic and things like that. Well, there's nothing new under the sun, guys. Humans have been over spiritualizing faults of the carbon based life form for a very, very long time, and will continue to do so for a very, very long time. I am sure of it. Um, sometimes you spend enough time in front of the microphone, and you're like, ooh, that's gonna piss somebody off. But you know what I mean.
Maybe.
It
Yeah.
is what it is. But we've been over spiritualizing that for a long time, and I like the way that you addressed it. That sometimes you have to look at it from the standpoint of what happened in the generation before me, and then put yourself in their shoes and then say what happened the generation before them. That's different. Now mind you, you're talking about 2 generations back, but you're also doing it from the perspective of trying to look through the lens of the generation that was right behind them, and walk the path back in time, so to speak, and be able to take a look at more of a micro level rather than trying to take it in from a macro level, and say, well, wait a minute, if every single generation had somebody who contended with this, then there might be something to the fact that it is genetic, or it is learned from generation to generation,
Right.
or something along those lines, and start to think through what that looks like from a very tangible standpoint, rather than trying to over spiritualize it, or don't take um accountability for it, and say that it's the demon of, it's the spirit of, it's something external to myself. Of I try very hard to get, I've been trying over the years of doing public ministry and all of that to get better about not tipping my hand, and not preaching my perspective, I
Right.
guess. um it is not hard to look for and find where I fall and what I think about things like deliverance ministry and stuff like that. And there's a variety of reasons for that. There's a lot of context to that as far as what, and I'm not going to go into all of that right now. But again, that's simply a spot where we can pull off the track
Yeah.
and get lost from what's actually happening here by using this. Again, I'm trying to adopt the philosophy of, okay, if you're going to preach that, and if you're going to believe that, My job is not to convert you into a different way of thinking. But what I am going to say is if you're going to use this, that like you've got to go elsewhere to try and find your justification for the stance because it doesn't exist here. And that's that, just being authentic to what the text says and all of that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. And when I look at this chapter, and again, this is one of those chapters that could become a huge derailment to someone's journey through, reading the Bible, and they're like, "Oh, here we go, there he goes again." These severe and seemingly unnecessary punishments. But there's a couple of things that we want to address, and kind of think about. Number one, I shared this with the guys last night, is that God knows how things are going to turn out. That doesn't mean that He's making things turn out. Let's make sure we say that. Foreknowledge doesn't mean determination. Just because I know what's going to happen doesn't mean I'm going to make it happen, right? But because He knows the suffering and the cycles and the things that are going to happen to Israel, God steps in on the front end and says, these punishments need to be severe because I need to deter you from doing the things that are going to land you in these places that I don't want you, right? And it's like a parent, and people don't like parents like this. I said, man, uh, I've got to sit you down and discipline you here because I don't want you to grow up, right? And have to be disciplined by an employer, and you lose a job, and now you're suffering in that area, or in relationships because you don't know how to interact with people in relationships, so you're having terrible relationship after terrible relationships. And so wanting to head something off at the pass, God's punishments are severe, and this is an agreement. This is not, I'm just saying this, they are agreeing to these things, which makes it a covenant relationship. So it's not just God knowing, how bad these things will affect them in the future, these sins that they commit that don't seem like a big deal, but it's also an agreement that God is making with them, that I'm going to be with you, that I'm going to bless you, and just like there's outrageous things that could happen to you in the negative, there's going to be amazing things that happen to you in the positive. And this is for Israel. Again, this is for Israel. Let me say it again. This is for Israel, right? This is his covenant with Israel. Is Israel at this particular time, and this is all about them going into their promised land. That's what this is about. This is not about Christians in 2024. You know, this is about Israel and preparing them for their promised land, and he's helping them to understand, you know, how to, be good to one another and how to love him. Again, it's always going to boil down to those two things: love and reverence, devotion and respect for God, and then respect for your neighbor, kindness towards your neighbor, and because some of these things will impact the community. You think, okay, I just did this, but some of these things that he's telling them, hey, you can't do, is because of what it'll do to the community as a whole. So it can affect everybody, and then finally, really keeping them separate, from the other nations, keeping them quote unquote holy, right? People don't like saying that anymore, right? But this is what he's doing. He's sanctifying them and making them holy and separate from the other nations around them, that they're not acting and doing and looking like those other nations because they are God's people. And so this again is a difficult chapter to swallow, just like some of the other ones, because of the severity of the consequences to the actions. But these actions, the consequences are that way because it's deterring them and trying to protect them from going down a trail that will ultimately lead to these type of things happening to them anyway. Captivity comes on them anyway because they go and do this. And he's like, I don't want any of these things to happen to you, so look, don't do this, and we don't need to enact these punishment. I was talking to a parent the other day, and they were saying, well, what do I do? My kid is this age, young kid, and they're just so rebellious, and they're talking back to me, and da 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 da. And I'm like, well, you're going to have to, first of all, have a conversation with them and understand why they're responding this way. And then you're going to have to, whatever, the potential consequences are for these actions, you're going to have to make that an agreement.
Mhm.
And then reading this, I'm like, wow, this is exactly how God dealt with Israel. He didn't just say, this is what I'm going to do to you. He said, here's what I desire from you. Here's the best for you. This is the best outcome for you. And here's what happens if you go this way. Do you agree?
Right.
That is a huge missing piece when people argue of the awfulness of God, right? They miss the covenant agreement, that this was an agreement made, that Israel is this not being imposed on Israel. Israel agreed to this because of the great benefit that was coming to them, having their own land, eventually having kingdoms and kings, and all these things that Israel ended up having was part of this agreement of God's blessing on them. But in the agreement, there was consequences for disobedience. And so obedience brought blessing, disobedience brought negative consequences. And they agreed to this, and
Mhm.
so that's the big piece. It's not God is just, running around, controlling and manipulating. This is a covenant agreement.
Right. Right. All right. So let's go ahead and wrap up Leviticus with chapter 27. Again, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when someone makes an explicit vow, he shall be valued according to your assessment of persons belonging to the Lord. If your assessment is of a male from 20 years even to 60 years, from 20 years even to 60 years old, then your assessment shall be 50 shekels of silver by the shekel of the sanctuary. Or if a person is a female, then your assessment shall be 30 shekels. And if the person is from 5 years even to 20 years old, then your assessment for a male shall be 20 shekels, and for a female, 10 shekels. And if the person is from a month even up to 5 years old, then your assessment shall be 5 shekels of silver for a male, and for a female, your assessment shall be 3 shekels of silver. Even if the person is from 60 years old and upward, if a male, your assessment shall be 15 shekels, and for a female, 10 shekels. And if he is poorer than your assessment, then he shall be presented before the priest, and the priest shall assess him according to the means of one who is vowed. The priest shall assess him. Now, if it is an animal of the kind that one can present as an offering to the Lord, any such animal that one gives to the Lord shall be holy. He shall not replace it nor exchange it, a good for a bad or a bad for a good. Yet if he does exchange animal for animal, then both it and its substitute shall be holy. If, however, it is any unclean animal of the kind which one does not present as an offering to the Lord, then he shall place the animal before the priest, and the priest shall assess it as either good or bad. As you, the priest, assess it, so shall it be. But if he shall ever want to redeem it, then he shall add a fifth of it to your assessment. Now, if someone consecrates his house as holy to the Lord, then the priest shall assess it as either good or bad. As the priest assesses it, so shall it stand. Yet if the one who consecrates it should want to redeem his house, then he shall add a fifth of your assessment price to it, so that it may be his. Again, if someone consecrates to the Lord part of the field of his own property, then your assessment shall be excuse me, then your assessment shall be proportionate to the seed needed for it. A homer of barley seed at 50 shekels of silver. If he consecrates his field as of the year of Jubilee, according to your assessment, it shall stand. If he consecrates his field after the Jubilee, however, then the priest shall calculate the price for him proportionate to the years that are left until the year of Jubilee, and it shall be deducted from your assessment. If the one who consecrates it should ever want to redeem the field, then he should add a fifth of your assessment price to it, so that it may belong to him. Yet if he does not redeem the field, but has sold the field to another person, it may no longer be redeemed. And when it reverts to in the Jubilee, the field shall be holy to the Lord, like a field banned from secular use. It shall be for the priest as his property. Or if he consecrates to the Lord a field which he has brought, which is not part of the field of his own property, then the priest shall calculate for him the amount of your assessment up to the year of Jubilee, and he shall on that day give your assessment as holy to the Lord. In the year of Jubilee, the field shall return to the one whom he bought it, to whom the possession of the land belongs. Every assessment of yours, moreover, shall be by the shekel of the sanctuary. The shekel shall be 20 gerahs. However, a firstborn among animals, which is a firstborn, belongs to the Lord. No one may consecrate, whether ox or sheep, it is the Lord's. But if it is among the unclean animals, then he shall redeem it according to your assessment, and add to it a fifth of it. And if it is not redeemed, then it shall be sold according to your assessment. Nevertheless, anything which someone sets apart to the Lord for destruction out of it that he has, of man or animal, or of the field of his own property, shall not be sold nor redeemed. Anything set apart for destruction is most holy to the Lord. No one may have been set, no one who may have been set apart among mankind shall be ransomed. He must be put to death. Now all the tithe of the land, of the seed of the land, or of the fruit of the tree is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. If therefore someone should ever want to redeem part of his tithe, he shall add to it a fifth of it. For every 10th part of the herd or flock, whatever passes under the rod, the 10th one shall be holy to the Lord. He is not to be concerned whether it is good or bad, nor shall he exchange it. Yet if he does exchange it, then both it and its substitute shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed. These are the commandments which the Lord commanded Moses for the sons of Israel on Mount Sinai. All right. So yeah, I mean that's that's Leviticus, folks. I mean, real simple stuff. No, I'm playing.
Right.
So again, I would say that this is further example of why it's important to take the sum total of all of this section of scripture, because this is the continued giving of ways of being, ways of handling, what's what, all of that kind of stuff to a people who are literally building from the ground up, building from complete and total scratch.
Yeah. Kind of looking through this chapter, man, there's a lot here with these various breakdowns. Because what was interesting to me, I was like, okay, so what is this deal about dedicating houses and lands, to the Lord, and again, it's like you gotta understand the full picture. And it's almost like you gotta keep in your head what you've read before this point. Because if you focus in on this point, you're like, okay, I don't get it. But then if you remember what you've been reading, like, okay, this is just a continuation of these things. And so, the the Levites or the priest, they are not actually going to get a land when they go into the promised land. And so when they dedicate houses and lands to the Lord, it's actually for the Levites or the priests to have somewhere. That's why they come and inspect it, because it's like, well, why did the priests? How come the priests are coming and they're inspecting it, and if it's good, then well, they end up living in it. They end up using that land because they are dedicated to the Lord, so they don't get a land, right? Everybody else is going to get a land. They've got a land that's carved out for them and they get it, but the Levites don't, because the Levites belong to the Lord. And so the others end up dedicating certain things so that they'll have something. And it's like, I mean, again, different world, different rules, different setup. It's just a really, I say interesting. Some other people say, I don't understand it. I don't think it should be like that. But this is the way it was. You know, this is how God kept everybody taken care of. You know, so I thought that was very interesting. And then I don't know if I had this discussion with you or someone. I might have had this discussion with my daughter. Because you know her well, about the whole value of the different, male slave at this age, you get this amount for, female at this age, you get this amount for. And I remember having that discussion, and like, this just looks bad.
Yeah.
This just looks bad. But when you actually, assess it and you break it down, it's about their ability to work is what makes them more valuable, right?
Right.
A younger man that's stronger, he can do more. So in that economy, he's worth more. It still doesn't sound good when you say it
No.
out loud, right? I'm not trying to make it sound better, but this is the logic here. An older man is you're gonna get less because they can do less. They're not as strong. They don't have that many years, to
Yeah.
be able to. And so this is what it's reflecting, is
Right.
not on their value as a human being, you
Right.
know. And so yeah. Anyway,
It's not devoid of logic or substance. It just has a bad mouthfeel, because
yeah,
if the language model means something very, very different in today's world, and
right,
this economy structure is so foreign to people in 2024.
right.
As in the West, there are other parts of the world where, while not the same, would have an easier time being able to wrap their mind around what this looks like. And so if you're talking to a predominantly Western audience, then you are going to struggle with that language model and all of that. Um it's why it's so vitally important to approach with a basis of emphasizing the academic. I think that's what I mean.
Okay.
Because if you have a safety net of words mean things, this is what the exhaustive definition of this phrase or this term or this concept is, or being able to um, study and not just have a plain reading of the text, which, for those of you that don't know, plain reading means to take it very literally.
Mhm.
And oftentimes when folks read it plainly, they read whatever their language model is. into the text. And if you read your language model into this, or if you read a 2024, a modern language model into this, you are going to miss the point, and wildly. You are going to end up with in the wrong part of town. You're going to end up with the wrong idea of what's actually going on here, or anything like that, because it's just an entirely different time, an entirely different place, an entirely different people, all of that kind of stuff. And so when you're walking through each one of these notes, just really throughout the entirety of the book, it's 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 vitally important to remember two things. A, they chose this, like Ant said, and B, the context of what's actually happening here and what these things mean. Because you might not walk out of it saying, hey, I vibe with that group of people's way of life. But
Right.
at the same time, you're also going to be authentic to the source material and have a solid understanding of who the players are involved, what's actually happening, God's role in the whole thing, all of that kind of stuff. And it will help you to not get lost in the weeds when trying to make heads or tails of what's going on here.
Yeah, just to dive just a little bit deeper into the dedication of the land and property, right? And so, just like everything else that we've been talking about, number one, to love God. And so, they're dedicating these lands and these properties, saying that God, well, it all came from you anyway. Psalms 24, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof and everything that's in it, right? And so they're showing that, hey, this came from you anyway. So dedicating it back to you is not a problem. But it also, is saying that this being holy, it's set apart for your use. And so
Mhm.
what do you want to do with this land and this property? We give it over to you that you can do what you need to do with it. And that's where the priests, it ends up being a support to the priests, those that have nothing, those that are without. God then uses it, for that. But the thing here that's interesting, just like in the last chapter, is this ability to redeem it.
Mhm.
I like, wow, this is just really interesting because it kind of is like, okay, well, if I dedicate this to the Lord, then it's the Lord's. But just like everything else, after that 50 years, if you want to redeem it, you can redeem it. If you want it back, you can redeem it back. And they have a process of redeeming that back. And so I thought that was interesting. You know, which is so that what if a person dedicated that to the Lord and now they're homeless, right? Well, can they get that back? Yes, because again, the land is going to be divided up, and I'm speaking, from chapters ahead. And I know for some people are like, "Oh, you're losing me by doing that," but it's like I can't really talk about this without that information, knowing that they're going to divide up these lands to each one, and each one's going to have their land. And so when they do this and they dedicate this, this is land that is promised to them, and so what they do with it, God is going to honor it, and he actually wants them to have it. So it's not like he
Mhm.
doesn't want them to have it, which
Right.
is which is interesting because, and I know you've covered this already, and that was a very difficult chapter for you in Acts chapter 5. There's a conversation that is had between Peter and Ananias, and especially Sapphira, because he actually has the conversation where he says the property was yours to do what you wanted with it. Why not be honest and say, this is what we're doing? It's not like God wanted to take your property. So you were like, well, we better hide it. We better not let them know how much we have,
Right.
because that might mean that we have to give it all. No, it was never that. It was, this is how, if this is what we were going to give, this is what we're going to give, and I look at things like that and I see parallels, because it's like, we think that God is just bullying people, right?
Mhm.
And things are happening in certain ways, but they're really not happening that way. There's more nuance to the story.
Yeah.
And even here, he's like, look, you dedicated to me. Hey, if you need this back, then there's a way to redeem it and bring it back into your family, which is I don't know. When I'm reading these things, I'm like, wow, he's really covering stuff that I wouldn't think you would have to cover. But it's because it's a blank canvas. There's nothing in place.
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't know, you've built the business, right, from scratch. And there's things you have to think about
Yep.
that the average person will like, well, really? You got to think
Yeah.
about that? Yeah, I actually have to think about this because there's a potential for this. They even when you're, putting it together, you got to figure out how you're going to dissolve it. At the how do we break it down well, I'm just thinking about building the business. I'm not thinking about if it fails, how I break down the assets and all. So it's
Yeah.
like totally everything is being thought of in this complete picture. And every time something is brought up, you're like, what is this about? Because you're not thinking about all these aspects of this. So I
Yeah.
just think it's really interesting, Leviticus as a whole.
And it is. It's not, to me, the most vibrant beauty is when you allow each and every part of it, even the parts that are hard and they've got a bad mouthfeel, to rest in the entirety of what's going on, in the entirety of canon. That's why I'm not like, I am not one of those people that are like, if you need this thing, turn to this chapter of scripture. And people get hot at me about that, like, oh, people should just, if they want counsel, or if they want to feel better or whatever, they should just read the entirety of the Bible every single time. No. But if you don't have a basis for the entirety of the story, and you're just going around and grabbing stuff out from different places, you don't really understand the entirety of the story, and it cheapens the verses that you're grabbing for. And B, even if you have it right, and that's what that verse is actually saying, it's magnified 100-fold with being able to understand it within the context. So rather than being worried about where can I go to find this very specific thing, let's spend that time focusing on understanding the biblical story and spending time in a variety of places, because it's the eternal struggle of, when we read the scriptures, what are we reading the right thing? Are we getting the right message? Are we in the right? And I think that's what stops people up a lot of the time from just cracking the thing open and going for it.
Right.
Just reading. And that's where how I view books like this, because any one of these individual parts can be very hard to wrap your mind around, and it's a lot easier to conceive of the fact that God is working with a blank canvas with a group of people that chose to follow him, when you take the full big picture into account,
Yeah.
especially with the first five, because now you're going back to, he's talking about, I was either in this last chapter or the chapter before, if you do this, I'll remember my covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. To understand what's being called on there, to understand what's being said there, you need the backstory of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which means you got to go back to Genesis.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you can't do individual book studies. I'm literally walking people through doing that with Acts. I'm not saying you can't read certain sections of scriptures at certain times. The liturgical calendar literally does that. I'm fine. It's just a matter of being able to steep yourself in the story, to be able to see the continued narrative of the character, of the personhood, of the heart of God, that's on full display for time and memoriam, and how he calls us to be, and how he has been continuing to give dominion to his creation, to bring about his preferred will here on the earth. And I would go as far as to say that if we look at the big picture, it helps to satiate that itchy part in the back of our brains that feels the need to grab onto things that explain away or control away different aspects of the story, and not resorting to this ism, this ist, to try and give a more tactile presence to something that isn't necessarily, that's the Bible doesn't speak to, or those verses don't mean that, or those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I like the way that it ends, that these are the statutes and commandments given to the Israelites on Mount Sinai. Because I think in our mind we've left Sinai,
Mhm.
right? But this is the conversation that is happening on Mount Sinai. These are the agreements, again, that are being made. This is the contract being signed. This is the handshake, or whatever you want to call it, right? This is all happening on Sinai.
Mhm.
And it is happening, and they are agreeing to it, and they're saying okay, and they're going forward with these rules in place, so
Mhm.
that when they come into the land that was promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? When it would come into that land, they know how to live and know how to conduct themselves in the land that they're going into. And I think context is king, right? And so remembering that the context of this that started in Exodus, right? Exodus 19, all the way to this point, right? This is all happening on Mount Sinai, which warps our time. Like it's like, okay, you're thinking, oh, that happened in Exodus 19. No, this is still a part of that, and so all of this seems like it's I don't know, hundreds of years later or something. I don't know, but it's really all one time frame, and I don't know if it's a few months, a few weeks, right? But because the way we're reading it, we're thinking that, oh, we've shifted into a different time, and training our mind to read in context and keep it in the confines of the context that it's in is difficult, because I know anybody who's been following with us, you're thinking, okay, well, these laws are being given when? Well, they're still at Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
They're still there. They have not left. They haven't gone anywhere yet. This is still, and this is just it mapped all the way out. It being all the way out is kind of like, and it's kind of like their, what do you call it? Their constitution. This is their version of that.
Yeah.
If I can use that terminology.
Yeah, and that's, it's hard because up until this point, at several different points, we've seen the fast forward button get hit,
Yeah.
where there's large swaths of time that just simply are not spoken to. And that's pretty much through the entirety of Genesis at different points, and even from Genesis into Exodus, some undistinguished amount of time has passed. And so with that kind of pacing, and the fact that we don't hear all about Moses's early life, that we see, even time skips there, that it's easy to then read that same perspective into this, and into what's happening here. And this is the one point where that those time skips stop. We're now just we're following this specific thread out, and we will be following this out through the rest of the five into Joshua. So as so at this point now we are dug into like the whole thing is a continuous narrative, but we're not gonna time jump now. These are our characters now for a while.
Hmm.
And so frame what we're reading, and as we're processing the wilderness, and as we're processing them taking the land and all of that kind of stuff, that these are the building blocks that we're following out. And then from that point, once we follow it out, is where you get to what do generations do with it afterwards? How do people act afterwards? And we kind of go back to time jumps, following specific people, and kind of that there's an ebb and flow on the speed in which we're moving from thing to thing to thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
So, folks, that's all. That's it. That's a wrap on Leviticus. Thank you all for joining us. We're just going to be picking right up with the next one starting next week. But until then, you want to go ahead and pray us out?
Yes, sir. Father, we are just so grateful and so thankful for your word. We thank you for the opportunity to share your word on these multiple platforms and reach, hundreds, I don't know, thousands of people with your word. I just pray, God, that we've been faithful in unpacking and sharing your word. And I just thank you for Joe and his heart to communicate the word of God. And I pray that everyone that hears this, that it will draw them back to the pages and that they would read through and that they would seek an understanding. The Bible says that wisdom is the principal thing in all of our gettings to get an understanding. So, Lord, help us to understand what your word is teaching us about you and your character and your heart and your desire, and what it is that you want for your people here and now, as we learn about what you wanted for Israel then and there. And so, Lord, I just thank you for this, and just pray that you bless the hearers, the listeners, the watchers, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right, guys. Thank you all. We will be back next week, same time, 9:30 a.m. Eastern. I will let you do the math from there to pick back up with our walk through the Old Testament. Tune in tomorrow, 9:30 a.m. Eastern as well for Let It Rip, where we are going to be continuing our mini series covering prosperity teaching. We're going to be going through some different verses that have been co-opted and might not mean what you think they mean, but we'll get more into that tomorrow. Guys, until next time, remember, you are prayed for, you are loved deeply. All right, peace, y'all.